anybody anonymously. As you heard, the meeting is going to be recorded so that people who weren't able to be here tonight will be able to listen to it later. And I'm sure this will never happen, but if anybody is behaving in what we consider to be a disrespectful or obstreperous or obstructionist way, they will be muted. And then they can choose to remove themselves, but they won't be allowed to continue to be part of the meeting. So thank you all once again for being here. I will start putting my name and contact details, as well as how to join the AJDS. Thanks, Harold.
Good, excellent. Well, the next step, I can see that there are some people who need to be admitted now, but I'll leave that for Gilda to do. Let me start by giving an introduction to Jeff Halper, and then we'll go immediately on to his address. Jeff Halper is an American-born anthropologist, author, lecturer, and political activist who lived in Israel since 1973. He's the director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions and a co-founder of the One Democratic State campaign. In the early 1990s, I quite distinctly remember consulting Jeff or his website, or maybe it was just via emails at that stage. I can't quite remember, but there was some, I think there was actually an article that you'd written, Jeff, which contained a whole lot of really interesting statistics about the settlers who were moving into the West Bank at that stage. And of course, in the early 1990s, we're not talking about anything like the numbers that are there today. So they were very useful. I remember as part of the AJDS circulating that information. So Jeff has been a peace and human rights activist for more than 3 decades and participated in the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movements in the US in the 1960s. He immigrated to Israel in 1973, as we mentioned, after attending rabbinical school. I wasn't aware of that. And becoming a Vietnam War resistor. In Israel, Jeff taught anthropology at Haifa and Ben Gurion universities. During his military service, he refused to bear arms or serve in the occupied Palestinian territories. In 1997, Jeff co-founded the Israeli Committee Against Home Demolitions. The Israeli Committee Against Home Demolitions. For this work, the AFSC, what was the AFSC?
American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers.
Ah, the Quakers, okay. They're the Hebrew Quakers are the Haredim, because the word Hared means to shake. And that's what they do. They quake in the same way as the Quakers. They're just on the Jewish side. For this work, the American Service Committee nominated him and the Palestinian activist Ghassan Andoni for the Nobel Prize in 2006. He also serves on the steering committee of the UN Conference on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. We think as Israelis that Jews and Arabs should live together. Jeff says, Palestinians have rights of self-determination just like we have. We have to fight also for their rights. One of our slogans is, we refuse to be their enemies. Jeff, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Harold. Thank you all from the AJDS for inviting me. I've been to Australia a number of times, but I don't think I've really met with you guys. Although in my next trip, I hope I do. And I want to thank Larry as well for really initiating this whole discussion. It's very important and very meaningful that you acknowledge the country and the First Nations as we begin this. When I speak to Canadian groups, they do that as well. In Israel, we would never think of doing anything like that. And that's already the first entry into this. Israel is also a settler colonial country like Australia is, but at least you've gone to the point where you're acknowledging that. You're acknowledging your settlers who refuse, your settlers that have a responsibility to work with the indigenous people. We're far, far from that here in Israel, where that idea of acknowledging even the Palestinian people's existence is something that's not even in the realm of people thinking about. So that gives us a beginning, at least into the discussion. You know, the organization I head, well, I'll try to make this brief because I want to give more time to Noura and Irving to speak and for questions. So I'll try to be brief. I'm not great at that, but I'm going to try. You know, the organization that I head, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, is a political group. It's not just an NGO. It's not just a human rights group. It isn't just a protest group. We deal with the issue of house demolitions, of course. Israel has demolished since 1948 somewhere around 140,000 Palestinian homes in the country. About 60,000, you know, since 1967 in the occupied territories alone. But demolitions take place inside Israel as well against Palestinian citizens of Israel. In fact, there are many years in which there are more demolitions in Israel than there are in the occupied territory. Now, so we deal with that within the framework of activists that are fighting the occupation and so on. But we've always been a political organization. So for us, the issue isn't house demolitions. You can end house demolitions tomorrow and that doesn't end the occupation or doesn't end the whole political situation we have. And so we've always used house demolitions as a vehicle for kind of opening a window into Israeli intentions. What are its intentions towards the Palestinians, towards the territories? How does the occupation work? Who makes decisions? What, of course, is the human cost of occupation? This isn't only an abstract political discussion. There's human beings involved, and so on. Now, you can't be in a political struggle without a political program, without an end game. I mean, you always have to resist, and Palestinians, of course, have been resisting for decades, for generations. You have to protest, you have to educate, you have to advocate, you have to do BDS, and everything. You have to do all those sorts of things. But they don't mean very much unless they're connected to a political program. Because the question is, well, what do you want? Where are you? What are we BDSing for? What's our end game? And unless you have an end game, then you're really not in the political game at all. So we've always been aware of the fact that as important as our resistance and protests and educational activities are, there has to be an end game. Now, the end game, of course, for many years, especially as we began in our first years, was the two-state solution. Whether or not we thought that was a viable solution, that was accepted by the PLO in 1988 under Arafat's leadership. So our view was, you know, I'm not going to be more Catholic than the Pope. If it's good enough for Arafat, it's good enough for me. And so we, like the rest of the Israeli peace movement, you know, accepted the two-state solution and tried to do what we could within that framework. Now, it's been clear for at least the last 15 years, if not more, that the two-state solution is gone. Now, not everybody's going to agree. This isn't a scientific proposition where there's a certain red line in which you could say this is where the two-state solution died. Meron Ben-Venishti, who's a very well-known Israeli historian, says that the two-state solution died back in 1977 when Begin was elected. There were some people that say, you know, the two-state solution died with the settlement enterprise. Or the two-state solution died with Rabin, and when the whole Oslo peace process began to collapse. Or the peace process died in 1996 when Netanyahu was elected. I mean, there's all kinds of red lines, and people can make arguments here and there. The point is that the two-state solution not only died, but I want to make another point, and that is there never was a two-state solution. Israel never, ever, ever entertained the idea that a genuinely sovereign and viable Palestinian state was going to emerge in the West Bank, certainly not in East Jerusalem, that Israel already annexed in 1967, and Gaza. That was simply not on the cards. Now, so from whenever you draw the line of the death of the two-state solution, you have today somewhere around 700,000 Israelis living in massive settlements throughout the West Bank. So it's very hard to even imagine in any way a two-state solution. From the time when the two-state solution died, whenever that was, until today, we've been in a political vacuum. In other words, we've been engaged in a political struggle, but without an end game. And there hasn't been, and of course, the end game really has to be articulated by Palestinians. This is a Palestinian struggle for liberation in which we critical Israelis or anti-colonial Israelis, anti-Zionist Israelis can be a part of that. And you can also be a part of it, of course. So you're a key part of that struggle, but it has to be led and formulated, articulated by Palestinians. And that's been missing. And that's the fatal flaw in our movement today. We can't go anywhere without a political program. So in the last 4 years or so, I've been involved with a group called the One Democratic State Campaign, which is a Palestinian-led organization. And what we've done, which is really significant, even though we're still in the stages of really consolidating any kind of a movement here, what we have done is to sit down Palestinians and Israeli Jews, and we formulated a 10-point political program, which you can find on our website, which is onestatecampaign.org. We have a 10-point manifesto that I might mention briefly, but that really, from my point of view, is a breakthrough. Because in my view, at least, and in the view of those of us in the One Democratic State Campaign, this is a very solid document. I mean, it really does address the underlying issues and grievances and causes of this conflict. Now, what's important here, and this is, I guess, the point I want to get into mainly, and that is that what our program does, what the One State Campaign does, is it accurately, let's say, analyzes what this situation is here. The problem we've been in all these years is that we've been calling this a conflict. This has been misanalyzed. And of course, it's like a doctor. If you go to a doctor with a disease and you're misdiagnosed and you get the wrong medicine, it could be great medicine, but it's not appropriate to your disease or to your illness. And that's what we've been in all these years. We've been in a conflict resolution mode of trying to resolve a conflict that is not a conflict. Zionism was a settler colonial movement. Very similar to what you have in Australia. I mean, I don't have to tell you what a settler colonial movement is. It was different in details, of course. And when I say the Zionists were settlers, I'm not trying to minimize in any way the genuine tie the Jews have to this country. In other words, that's a fundamental difference, of course. We weren't some British prisoner that got put in a boat and we ended up in Australia. Or a British farmer that gets up one day and decides to go to Kenya so he can get free land and cheap labor and get rich. That wasn't the motivation of Zionism. There was a genuine tie, historical, cultural, religious, all kinds of ties between Jews in this country. So I'm not saying the Jews are a foreign population that has no place in this country by any means, but there've been Jews that have lived here for millennia. When Zionism began, when the first Zionists stepped foot in this country, there were already 45,000 Jews living here. In fact, the Jews who were Sephardic Jews, what we call today Mizrahi Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, were a part of the indigenous Palestinian population. The Palestinians called themselves Palestinians who were Muslims, who were Christians, and who were Jews. And the Jews accepted that. The Jews were, at least the Sephardi Jews, were Ottoman citizens, but they were all part of the society. So I'm not saying there wasn't a tie between the Jews in this country, but what Zionism did, and this was its fatal flaw, was that Zionism adopted a settler colonial approach to the country. In other words, they could have immigrated to the country. Zionists could have said to the Palestinians 100, 125 years ago, look, we're being persecuted in Europe. We want to get out. We see ourselves as a nation, as a people, with rights of self-determination. We want to revive our national language. We want to come back home.
Thank you.
Okay? But, and this is the but that was missing. But we also acknowledge that there is a Palestinian people living here. And I'm not just projecting back 100 years. There were voices that said that at that time. I mean, there were voices like that. If they would have acknowledged it was a Palestinian people, then they would have said, we're willing to come as immigrants to the country. As immigrants, and we want to establish a presence in the country and develop our own national identity here, but within the framework of, and together with the local population. That would have been fine. But what Zionism did was something else. Zionism said, no, we're not coming as immigrants. We're not integrating into the local society. We don't even recognize as a local society. Remember the famous Zionist slogan that Palestine is a land without a people. I mean, they knew there were a bunch of Arabs running around. They had kind of their minds, Bedouins with kafiyas on the camels. That was their idea, but they didn't amount to a people with rights of national rights of self-determination. So it was a land without a people in that sense. So the Zionists then adopted, and this is the original sin. Zionism, rather than being an immigrant national movement that could have integrated into the country, Zionism decided, it chose to be a settler colonial movement. In other words, the Zionists said, this is our country. Palestine is a Jewish country. It belongs exclusively to the Jews. And in this, they were getting this exclusivity from two sources. One is the Bible, of course, where, in our Bible, our God gives us the land. And from Eastern Europe, because this was a type of tribal nationalism you had in Russia and Poland and Hungary, the places where most of the Zionists came from. In those countries, until today, they're xenophobic countries that say Russia belongs to Russians, Poland belongs to Poles, you see, and Jews were on the receiving end of that because they were never Russians or Poles or whatever. And so they brought that kind of tribal nationalism to Palestine and replicated it. Basically said, just like the Poles said, this is our country. This Palestine belongs to exclusively the Jewish people. And there is no other claimant. There is no other side. There is no other people. This is ours. And therefore our job as settler colonialists, and they called themselves settler colonialists. Don't forget, this is at a time when colonialism didn't have the bad name it has today. So, I mean, they used that term colonialism. You had the Jewish Colonization Association, which was one of the big organizations here. They said, our job is to Judaize the country. And by the country, they meant the whole country, from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River, not 78% of it, not the Green Line, the entire land of Israel. And the purpose of Zionism was to transform an Arab country into a Jewish country, transform Palestine into the land of Israel. And you do that, like all settler colonial projects, by taking the land and displacing the local population. That it's a unilateral process. That's the point. It's a unilateral process. So there's no conflict here. You're not in a conflict with the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. You're not in a conflict. There's conflict that's been generated. But settler colonialism is unilateral. That's why you acknowledge the First Nations presence. So here we're not in a conflict, because a conflict implies two sides. That somehow there's two sides that are fighting about something and they're both legitimate. And how do you resolve a conflict? You negotiate, you compromise, and you get to some kind of a deal. But that wasn't the point of Zionism, and that's why I say the two-state solution was never an option. The point of Zionism, and you see it as clearly today as you saw it 100 years ago, was to Judaize and take over the Palestine, turn Palestine into a Jewish country. And the Arabs, we don't even use the word Palestinians. The Arabs were not a side. They weren't to be, nobody asked them permission. Nobody said, can we come to this country? No one asked them if we can take their land or displace them, of course. There's never, ever, ever been negotiations. Even in the brightest days of Oslo, Israel never, until this day, has never recognized the existence of a Palestinian people with national rights. All Israel did in Oslo was to recognize the PLO as a negotiating partner, but with no end game. Israel did not accept the two-state solution. It did not, that wasn't part of the negotiations. They were open-ended negotiations with the PLO because Israel never accepted the Palestinians as a genuine partner or a side. There was never another side. This has always been unilateral, and it's very clear today that it's unilateral. So the point is then that if this isn't a conflict, conflict resolution doesn't work. Of course, Oslo and the roadmap and Annapolis, and think of all the millions of negotiations that have gone on are failures, because you can't end a colonial situation through conflict resolution. The only way to end a settler colonial project is decolonization. And decolonization means, and you're trying to do that to some degree in Australia, it means dismantling all the structures of domination and control, including ideological structures, including the mental structures that say this country belongs to us, and to create a new polity and a new civil society that's based on equal rights of everyone on the basis of citizenship. Now, decolonization means something else as well. And that is, and this is where South Africa is a good model, that is not only the creation of a new civil society, but beyond that, the creation of a new political community, a new us. So in other words, you keep the national identities that exist. Palestinians are going to remain Palestinians. Israeli Jews are going to remain Israeli Jews. And you have other groups here as well. You have Russians in this country. You have African asylum seekers in this country. It's more multicultural than you would expect. So you keep your national, ethnic, religious, and other identities. They're important. That's fine. It's a pluralistic society. But the hope is, and the goal is, that over time, as we're living together, and as we're participating together in a daily life, a new political community will emerge, especially among young people, so that there'll be a new us that doesn't neutralize our other identities, but transcends them to some degree. And let me end. I'm going to end on this because I do want to give time to everybody else. Let me end with a cute little example of what I mean by this sort of daily nation building. You know, I mean, you all know how important football is. We've just gone through the Euro, and you know how important the World Cup is. I mean, you guys are part of that whole thing. Well, you know, in the FIFA standings, the Palestinian national football team has a higher standing than the Israeli national team. But neither of us have managed to get into the World Cup. It's not exactly true. Israel did get in for one game, I think, back in the 50s, but basically neither side has managed to get into the World Cup. Imagine if in this new country of ours, in this one democratic state of equal rights, in which the refugees return, by the way, because that's crucial to this analysis, to this enterprise, in this one state that emerges, we have a football team that's strong enough to get into the World Cup. Can you imagine what kind of an us that would begin to create? Now our team is in the World Cup. Look what they did to Croatia a few years ago. The world discovered Croatia. I think the world would discover this new country, whatever it would be called. You know, those are the kinds of daily things that happen to build a new political community. So our idea is decolonization towards one democratic state. The refugees come home, and there's a logic to that because we're moving from a state that's based on an ethno-religious national model. Today in Israel, who you are, what your religion is, what your ethnic identity is, determines everything. Who you can marry, where you can live, what job you have, your civil status, your economic, everything is determined by that. We're going to get rid of all that. We have to decolonize, de-Zionize, if you want to put it that way, and create a state that's based on equal citizenship. Now, if it's equal citizenship, that means that the refugees don't only have the right to return on that basis, but they have the right to return as our citizens. They should come back. Just because you're driven out of the country in a war, or even if you leave voluntarily in a war, doesn't neutralize your civil status. You don't lose your civil status because you fled or were driven out during a war. So, in fact, the coming home of refugees makes sense from the point of view of a state that's based on citizenship, and they would come home as well. I'm not going to get into all the details. We can talk about it more later. I'll end on that, but that's in a sense the analysis that our political program is based on. And then we have we've worked out in the 10 points what this one state would look like and how it would function. And what we're trying to argue is that whether this is, I mean, we're not saying this is the program. We're throwing it out as a strong basis, for a future program that the Palestinians in particular have to develop. But it gives us a base, and what it does is it fills that vacuum. It begins to give us a political program now on which we can mobilize all of you for a just resolution of this situation. So I'll end my piece with that.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for that address. The way that we're going to organize this, we'll have responses from Noura and from Irving, and then a period of time when the three of you can have a discussion together for our benefit. But Jeff, before we go on, I'm very intrigued by something. Behind you is what appears to be a picture of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Can you explain more?
No, you see, you have to look closely. One of our volunteers did this. It's a famous picture of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who's seen as the Messiah by his followers. But look carefully at the picture.
Okay, I understand.
I had a student that said, "Stand like this." And I said, "What?" It took my picture and then. Anyway, that's just the cute thing.
Well, let me introduce Noura. Noura is a Palestinian educator, a writer, activist, and community organizer from Akko, which is in the north of Israel, or the mid-north. She studied political science and education and received masters in international relations from Haifa University. Noura has been involved in development and community work with non-government organizations in Jerusalem, West Bank, and Palestine. She has worked with international NGOs and solidarity movements in Korea and Australia, where she is now based and works in the Education Centre. Noura is also a debate trainer and has taught and trained in many international forums in Asia, Middle East, Europe, and Australia. Noura, over to you. Thank you. Oh, could you unmute?
That's correct. Thank you for the reminder, Harold, and for the introduction. I want to start by thanking the Australian Jewish Democratic Society for organizing this forum and for creating the space to have these, somewhat difficult yet very important conversations that we so desperately need to continue having if we are genuine about our intentions in bringing about a sustainable solution. What a pleasure it is to be speaking in the same forum as Jeff. This is, by the way, the second time in the last month. So I'm detecting a trend here. Jeff, please let me know when next you're speaking so I can organize accordingly. I'm also looking forward to hearing from Irving and to the discussion or questions that may arise from our conversation tonight from the audience. For the last 5 years, I have had the privilege of living on Wurundjeri country here in Naarm, also known as Melbourne. And I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and the custodians of this land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I would also like to recognize their ongoing struggle against settler colonialism and the impact that colonization has on colonized people and colonized land. I've also been lucky in another sense to be born in Akka, one of the most magical places in the world, and lucky to be raised by one of the most loving and nurturing communities as well in Akka. Akka is what, in Israel, people like to refer to it as a mixed city. If you ask me, there's nothing really mixed about it, unfortunately, because Palestinians and Jewish people in Akka lead a very different and segregated life. And all the socializing or the socialization attempts that may naturally occur between neighbors and prematurely due to policies that are intended to widen the gap between Jewish and Palestinians in Akka, but also between Jewish people and Palestinians in general. One of my early childhood memories is during the first Intifada when I was almost 5 years old, is coming back home from my grandmother's house in the old city of Akka to my parents' house. We used to live in Ha'ilan, in northern Akka street, which is predominantly a Jewish neighborhood. Coming back home and then to watch my father getting attacked by our Jewish neighbors, who normally we would greet good morning and good night. One of them was trying to smash my father's head with a brick. My family was attacked at that night because my father decided to hang a black flag over our window because one of his cousins, actually in Jenin, was killed during the events of the Intifada. Now, why am I telling you this? I'm sharing this with you because I want to show that anti-Palestinian sentiment is deeply entrenched in the Israeli mainstream. The indoctrination process that consists of continuous dehumanization and demonization of Palestinians and Arabs in general starts at a very young age and carries through all of the messaging that Israelis receive from mainstream media and the politicians. Now, obviously, the goal of this is to rally support amongst Israelis behind Zionism as a political movement that privileges Jewish people and creates systems that sustain and perpetuate Jewish domination and supremacy over Palestinians. As Jeff mentioned earlier, is that the bedrock of Zionism as a settler colonial movement is the removal and erasure of the native indigenous population in Palestine. And we've seen that during the events of the Nakba in 1948. This is also reflected, also as mentioned by Jeff, in Zionist rhetoric of land without people for people without land. And obviously manifests in Israeli expansionist policy through settlement expansions and ongoing dispossession of Palestinians. For instance, as we see today in Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah. Now, the Palestinian struggle is mainly about protecting Palestinian people and Palestinian land. It is a struggle for equality, for freedom and justice. Now, for these universal values to be upheld in Israel and Palestine, structural changes need to take place. Without a doubt, the last century has been catastrophic and extremely violent for the Palestinians. And it's not because of natural disaster, it's not because of a tsunami or a bushfire. It is because of man-made policies and ideologies. And therefore, the situation needs to be addressed politically, also as suggested by Jeff. The good news is that it's all reversible. And the way forward should be through rectifying the wrongs that have been done, through reversal of policies, decolonization of land and mines, and creation of an alternative that provides protection, freedom, equality, and justice for all, but first and foremost, for the Palestinian people. This needs to be done by engaging the Palestinians as key stakeholders and main actors in this context. And when I say the Palestinian people engaging the Palestinian people, I'm not talking about the Palestinian Authority. I'm not talking about the Oslo Authority. I'm talking about the real Palestinian people. I'm talking about the 14 million Palestinians living in Gaza, in the West Bank, in 1948, and in the diaspora. So all of these affected communities or affected groups, meaning the Palestinians, in their different places around the world, must be included in the decision-making process. And the needs or their issues also must be addressed and addressed obviously in a just manner. Because whatever future solution that we are hoping to achieve, for it to be sustainable, it needs to address all of these affected groups, basically. Now, this vision obviously is captured under the one decolonized democratic state that is between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. The other point that I would like to emphasize here is that also the Palestinian struggle is about Palestinian unity and the unity of the Palestinian people, but also unity of land. So we don't think it's fair to divide neither the land nor the people. So we want a solution that includes all of the land and all of the people. a solution, again, that provides equality and justice and freedom for all. So that is my 2 cents on the matter. Having said that, also keep in mind that this is Noura speaking. Noura, you know, the Palestinian who was born in Israel. And I think any discussion about future Palestinian solution or Palestinian right to self-determination needs to include different Palestinians as well, who have been affected differently by the Nakba events. Probably the last point that I would like to make, and that is a point that was also mentioned by Jeff, you know, that framing of Zionism versus Judaism. And I just want to emphasize that the struggle or the, you know, conflict, quote unquote, is definitely not a religious conflict as we see. It is not a conflict between Muslims or Jewish people, as you know, we've seen alliances being forged between Muslims and Jews on both sides of the spectrum, Zionists and non-Zionists. And you know, as Muslims, but also as Palestinians, we recognize the historical link that Judaism has to the land, but we reject that Zionism is native or indigenous to Palestine. Political Zionism. We think Zionism, political Zionism in the form that it exists today, that manifests in the Israeli state, is a European product, is a settler colonial movement, and it's the product of Europe. It's the product of European dynamics in history, that it was influenced by the Renaissance and the nation state concept, and has nothing to do, therefore, with Palestine in that region. Just wanted to make that distinction clear. While we do recognize Judaism as a part of my culture as well, as Palestinian, but also as a Muslim, we absolutely reject that Zionism has any claim to the land. And that's it. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Noura. We will move immediately to, sorry, I just want to make sure I've got the view okay. But by the way, could people put up their hands if Noura was filling the screen? That is, was I able to do that just for me, or? Okay, good, thank you. All right, now, excuse me. We're going to move on to Irving Wallach, who's going to talk about his view of these matters. Irving is a left-Zionist, a two-state supporter, and against the occupation. He's a Sydney barrister, the son of Polish Holocaust survivors, with family still living in Poland. Irving has been at the bar for almost 20 years. Previously, for 12 years, he was a solicitor with the Legal Aid Commission, with the Health Care Complaints Commission and South Coast Aboriginal Legal Service. Irving is on the Legal Aid Commission's panel of barristers for complex criminal matters, and has also conducted prosecutions for government agencies, including WorkCover. He was the chairperson of the Nurses Tribunal for 12 years until 2005. He's a former executive member of the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies, a former Secretary General of the World Union of Jewish Students, a former head of Beitar Australia, and a former chair of the Zionist Youth Council of New South Wales. I remember meeting him in my student days down in Melbourne at some conference of the Australian Union of Jewish Students. It's a very, very long time ago, sometime in the 70s. Irving, you'll need to unmute yourself, but please take the floor.
Thank you, Harold. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional custodians of our land, Australia. I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, being Sydney, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I remember, Harold, again, in very foggy terms from those days way back in August, where the leadership of August at that stage already stood out, and in a very different fashion to the current leadership. We stood out then, even in the middle 70s and the late 70s, as advocates of a two-state solution. In other words, a secure and recognised Palestinian state alongside of secure and recognised Israel. That, even at that stage, put us on quite shaky ground with the mainstream Jewish community leadership. But nevertheless, it's something that it's certainly a point of view that I've stuck with ever since, because I certainly acknowledge it as being the only real solution that is going to bring about peace and not ongoing conflict between the Jewish Israelis as well as the Palestinians who live in Israel. Now, Jeff, the title of tonight's session is based on Jeff's book about Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine, Zionism and settler colonialism in the case for one democratic state. Now, of course, in the days when I was involved at university, what was being presented by the PLO at that stage, that's in the early and middle 70s, was a case for a secular democratic state of Palestine. So this, I suppose, in that sense, is the follow-up, the inheritor, the successor from that position. And the other interesting question is, of course, what was meant by the PLO that then about a democratic secular state of Palestine. And of course, that was effectively defined by what was written in the Palestine National Covenant in those days. And it basically meant not just a de-Zionized Israel, but it meant, according to the Palestine National Covenant, basically the non-participation and the exclusion of Jews and Jewish citizens of Israel, in effect, who had arrived after 1948. Now, what has been presented by both Jeff and by Noura is basically a Palestinian plan. It's not a plan for the majority of Israeli citizens, and it's not a plan beyond that quite narrow base. And the real question, I suppose, is who really wants to have this one state of Palestine? Now, of course, in the early days of the Oslo process, there was a and really going into the years, quite a long time afterwards, well into the last 10 or 20 years ago, the large majority of both Israelis and Palestinians both wanted a two-state solution. Both peoples wanted a large majority of both people, something like 2/3 in both cases, wanted their own state and their own national state. What Jeff speaks about in terms of a decolonized state basically is a Palestinian state, and it is its great flaw, I'm sad to say, is that it basically ignores the wishes of something like the large majority, 70 or 80% of the majority of Israelis, of Jewish Israelis, who are themselves Israeli citizens. So it's basically, it proceeds and wants to go ahead without the approval and support of something like 70 to 80% of the population. Now, of course, with the ongoing progress and it's something which I regard and can only be ever regarded as a great backward step and a danger to the whole of the Israeli and Palestinian people. But as the occupation has gone on, and has been effectively fostered under the Netanyahu years, the support for the two-state solution has dropped amongst both Israelis and Palestinians, to the point where now amongst Palestinians, certainly a majority, it can be seen, seems to be in favour of regaining all of historic Palestine. Now, amongst Israelis, the support for already faith in the two-state solution has also been dropping as a result of the ongoing occupation, and as a result, for example, also of actions such as the Second Intifada and Hamas's quite antagonistic and aggressive attitudes towards Israel from Gaza. But be that as it may, the point is that even amongst the Palestinians, what Palestinians want is not something akin to what's been described by Jeff as a decolonized state. What Palestinians appear to want, on the basis of opinion polls, is their own Palestinian national state. And that really is the issue. So it is really reducing things to a meaningless terms and meaningless language to try and wash out this term conflict in the argument and in the debate. Because quite clearly, there are two national groups living in the one country, in the one land, and each of those groups, the Palestinians on the one hand and the Israelis on the other, basically want their own national state. So whichever way you want to look at it, the point is that neither side, the large majority of neither side, want to live in either either what might be called a one state, which is not their own national state. And the only just way to do that is by having a Palestinian national state as well as an Israeli national state alongside each other, living beside each other. And the other advantage of that is that it is basically the only solution which can lead to peace rather than conflict. Talk, in my view, of one state, whether it's one big state dominated by greater Israeli nationalists, or whether it's a state dominated by and promoted by greater Palestine nationalists, only leads to conflict, and not conflict resolution and not peace. And that, as far as I can see, is a recipe for there being a disaster at some stage further down the track. And when I say disaster, I can see it as a disaster for both peoples. Now, in terms of what's been discussed tonight, it's interesting that that again there's been this looseness of language, because, for example, when we talk about slogans, there has been a real change of language from 1948 onwards. 1948 was the watershed year. It followed on after the United Nations resolution for partition. Now, 1948 could have been a watershed in that 1948 could have led to the establishment of a Palestinian state and a Palestinian state alongside Israel. That never happened, and it always pains me to have to point out that it was the Zionists and the Zionist establishment that accepted the two-state solution. But the painful part the painful part to me is that it was in fact the Palestinian leadership that rejected it. Now, the fact that there was no Palestinian state established after May 1948 really comes down to events after that. Now, there was a war, in effect, from that point onwards between Israel and Arab states. When that war ended with the armistice arrangements in 1949, there could have been the establishment then of a Palestinian state. Now, that was prevented, and the Palestinian state, as we know, was strangled at birth by the Jordanians, who annexed the West Bank, and by the Egyptians, who moved in and occupied the Gaza Strip, which they kept under military occupation for some 19 years until 1967. Now, I'm not saying that as a matter of trying to go into a blame game. What I'm trying to point out is that you have to look at the events in Israel and Palestine by way of history, by way of the facts of history, not by what we wish would have happened. Now, that could have happened in 1948. We know it did not. ironically, there's also been a real change in language since 1948. The irony of the language is that from 1948 onwards, the Israelis renamed themselves as Israelis. Before 1948, the irony is that the Israelis themselves had called themselves Palestinians. In fact, Jeff talks about the Soccer World Cup. The irony is that prior to 1948, two teams, the Israelis, in fact, what became Israelis, played in the Soccer World Cup on two occasions in 1934 and 1938 under the name of Palestine. So that gives you a nice, interesting touch, ironic touch in the way the language has changed. Be that as it may, the real difficulty that I see with Jeff's analysis is that it basically is a plan that he aims towards Palestinians, not towards the other half of the equation, which is the Israelis, of course. The other aspect, of course, which ironically, I think that Jeff himself acknowledges, is the strong and deep Jewish ties to Israel. And to a degree, I have to recognise, of course, that Noura recognises that as well, but in a quite fundamental way, and in a way which she is entitled to do that. But as Jews, the large majority of Jews today acknowledge the Jewish ties to Israel in much more than just a religious way. And they are seen to be ties to Israel by the Jewish people. The one factor that I think, and which I would be critical of both Jeff and Noura in particular, is the failure to recognise the fact that Jews have, from time immemorial, seen themselves as a people, not just a religious group. And that is, again, a historical fact that we, the Jews, have said about ourselves and have described ourselves. And that peoplehood did not simply materialise in the 19th century or the 20th century. It is a peoplehood that goes right back to Roman times, to Babylonian times, and to earlier. Because whatever one might say about the Bible or other things, and it's not, the Bible is not something that I point to as an authority that can or ought to be trotted out in any flippant way. But the point is that to talk about Indigenous, who's Indigenous and who is not, is really, as I see things, really almost a deliberate way to muddy the waters and to argue that one side can only be right and one side only can be wrong. And that, of course, goes down to the Palestinian side. Because if you really want to play the Indigenous card, then you have to ask the question, in Roman times, who were the Indigenous people? It was a Jewish country, and there's no doubt about that. I mean, one of the things that I, and again, this is something that means an enormous amount to me, is going to Rome and looking at the Arch of Titus. And looking at the Arch of Titus, and of course it is covered with the achievements, in inverted commas, of Titus. And right there in the Arch of Titus is the depiction of Roman legionnaires, Roman soldiers, carrying away the spoils of the temple, carrying away the seventh branched menorah and other treasures from the temple. Now, those are historical facts which cannot be denied. The fact that there was 2,000 years ago a Jewish state and a Jewish country. Now, I don't say that by any means to disentitle and in any way any Palestinian claims to their own state and to their own national roots in their own country. But it is important to bear those things in mind, because to deny those sort of things not only flies in the face of history, but it is part of, it can only be part of a means of delegitimizing the Jewish ties to Israel and the Jewish ties to that land, which are much more than simply what can be dismissed as it were, Jewish religious ties, because things have always gone much deeper and much beyond that. It pains me to hear slogans being put about such as Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, because whilst I fully recognise Palestinian rights to their national home, and whilst I also recognise the pain of the Palestinians that have been brought about by the Nakba and by the occupation, it's a two-way street. It's important for Palestinians as well to recognise the important fundamental Jewish ties to Israel, as well as the quite difficult and horrible history that Jews from Arab countries, the Mizrahi Jews, suffered as a result of and following the establishment of Israel in 1948. People tend to forget that there were many many Jewish Mizrahi communities in Arab countries throughout the Middle East who were effectively expelled. Now, I say all this because I think it's important to reset the debate, to understand that there are fundamental claims to nationhood which belong to both the Israelis, the Jews, as well as the Palestinians. And I think that recognising all of that is the fundamental aspect and the basis to pursuing some sort of a just and lasting peace. Now, I do not say it as part of any blame game. I say it simply as a recognition of real facts and a way of resetting the debate. Now, I can see that Harold is getting restive, and I can take the hint. And thank you very much for my opportunity to make those comments.
Thanks very much, Irving. And we're looking forward to the discussion that's going to ensue. I want to throw something in at this stage, because what we're going to do is we're going to throw the discussion open to Jeff, to Noura, and to Irving to respond to one another about some of the issues that have been raised. But I'd like to add something in here, because I'm quite intrigued by Jeff's book and who exactly it was aimed at, because in the initial instance, my impression was that it was aimed at a group of progressive people such as we are, as a way of trying to discuss ways forward in the current situation, and that this was a particular option. It's not necessarily the only option that might be on the table, but out of some sort of dialogue, these sorts of things would progress. As I read through the book, however, I came across a few quotes that made me think again about who this book was aimed at. So I'll just give you a couple of simple quotes there, just some sentences in Jeff's book. Towards the end, he says, "Now at this stage of the struggle, when anti-colonialism has become once again the only option, can a moribund PLO be revived?" And then he said, "In terms of a strategic alliance with anti-colonial Israelis, can the Palestinian grassroots, academics at the head, overcome their crippling stance of anti-normalization?" And then, although the struggle for freedom in Palestine has become a global issue, neither the Palestinian Authority nor Palestinian grassroots leadership has taken advantage of this wellspring of support to support a political plan. In other words, not just some words of protest, but to come out with something concrete, a political plan. The BDS campaign supports a rights-based approach, but its three demands, ending the occupation, enacting the right of return, and ensuring equal rights for Palestinian citizens of Israel, do not compromise a political program. So I started to think at that stage that maybe Jeff's book was in some ways, at least in part, a critique of the Palestinian leadership and the need for the Palestinian leadership to grasp the situation they're in and to show some not only leadership but planning. Now, I mention that because in contrast to Jeff's book, and Jeff makes mention of this, there is a fellow called Peter Beinart. He's fairly prominent in the US, and he's been writing about plans for a one-state resolution of the conflict, and I'll use that term conflict. I know that others here question it. And his criticism, it seems to me, is coming from exactly the opposite direction. He is saying, look, if Israel is not going to do other than to settle in the West Bank, then ultimately there is only going to be one state. In fact, Jeff makes that point in his book all the time. There is only one state at the moment. So from Peter Beinart's point of view, he's saying, look at the Jewish community or the Israeli government and the Israeli policy, and look where it's going. It's going in that one state direction. What would a one state look like from a Jewish perspective? So I'm throwing that into the mix because it sort of seemed, as I said, that Jeff seems to be doing in some ways a critique of the Palestinians. Peter Beinart seems to be doing a critique of the Jewish community worldwide, the Jewish diaspora and the Israelis. And it seems that they're both converging in many ways on this idea of a single state. So over to the three of you.
Can I jump in and correct you, Harold? It's Peter Beinart has not been talking about an Israeli or a Jewish perspective of a one state. What he's been talking about is the view and the vision of one state by Netanyahu and the right wing and the settlers. And what he says, and he describes quite accurately, is a recipe for ultimately a disaster, a catastrophe for both peoples, and a situation in which effectively the Palestinians who live in the West Bank would be second-class citizens. And that's something which I think is absolutely, completely unacceptable. Should never happen.
Jeff, would you like to say something on? Oh, you'll have to unmute.
No. To respond to your comments and a little bit to Irving, I mean, just to pick up the last thing you said, I mean, that's one of our points, is that there already is one state. I mean, the whole discussion, should there be one state or two states, is long gone. Now, I have to say, in reference to what Irving was saying about two peoples or two nations, two states, and each one wants a state, that's true. And we supported the two-state solution for many years. I'm not against the two-state solution, especially if it's accepted by the PLO. My point is that it's Israel that opposed the two-state solution. The Palestinians accepted it. Until today, Abu Mazen accepts a two-state solution and would sign off tomorrow morning if he could. The Palestinians accepted it. The international community accepted it. That's the program of the international community as well. The only holdout has been Israel. And it's not that only that Israel has rejected the two-state solution, but that Israel, in fact, has worked very, 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 very hard on the ground to foreclose it, to make it impossible. And I think they've gone well beyond that point of no return. So today there is one state already, by any measure of what a state is. You can't get into this country from any direction between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River without going through Israeli border controls. There's one effective government over this entire country, and it isn't the Palestinian Authority. There's one army, obviously. There's one integrated economy. There's one integrated infrastructure. One of the problems of Gaza is Gaza is dependent on the Israeli electrical company. There's one water system. There's one electrical system. There's one highway system. There's one phone system. there's, in terms of the West Bank has been incorporated into Israel with all kinds of highways. If you haven't been here for a while, it's crisscrossed with highways. That there's building a highway now from Jerusalem to Beersheba that goes through the West Bank. The way you go to Tiberias today from Jerusalem is to go through the West Bank. You don't go around. So there is no more territory that can be detached. It has been effectively integrated, incorporated into Israel proper. Now, what Israel has to do, of course, and this is the trick, is how do we take areas A and B, these little enclaves, and somehow disconnect them and give them a kind of a Bantustani type of a character. That's the problem. But the fact that this already is one country run by Israel between the Mediterranean, it's a fact already, and it's an irreversible fact. No one is going to make Israel go back. Not the international community, certainly not the United States, and so I think that, we have to start from not from where we want to be, not from what Irving was saying. Yes, the two peoples do have aspirations for a state of their own and all that stuff, but we have to start from where we are. And not from, and we're not going to go back, and we're not going to roll back to pre-Zionism. We're also not going to roll back to any point in 1988 when the two-state solution might have been possible. So that's one thing. And the other, another thing, just in terms of what Irving was saying about the two states, is that the UN might have done the partition plan, but the UN, there's layers of colonialism here. You have Zionist colonialism, but you also have British colonialism, in which the Zionists dictated the terms of the League of Nations mandate that was based on the Balfour Declaration, so that Israel co-opted and harnessed the British Empire's, colonial status to further its own ambitions here. And then the UN, what was the UN in 1947? It was really a collection of European colonial countries, basically, with a couple of Latin American countries thrown in. That's what the UN was in those days. The whole third world didn't exist. And here you have the UN. What authority did the UN have to partition Palestine against the wishes of the Palestinian population? What right did it have? The Jews were a third of the population. The vast majority of the Jews have come within the last 20 or 30 years. Versus the Palestinian majority of 2/3, on what legal right do the UN have to say 56% of this country is going to the Jews? This whole enterprise is colonial. There is no legitimacy, not to the UN partition plan, not to any of that. And in terms of the two-state solution, we have to really give some credit to the Palestinians here. The fact that they accepted the two-state solution, this is the only time, I think, in history that a colonized people gave 78% of its country. Now, we're talking about the two-state solution. We're not talking about some half and half deal. The Palestinian population is today the majority in this country, before the arrival of any refugees. About 51%, the majority of the population in this one country is Palestinian. And yet in this great two-state solution, they get 22% of the land, most of which is desert, the Judean desert. So that's not exactly a just and equitable solution. It looks good on paper. It doesn't look very good when you're talking about sovereignty and viability. And now what do you do with the millions of Palestinians? Not only get a mini state, but now they're forced to accept all the Palestinian refugees because Israel won't accept them into the 78% that's Israel. So it's not exactly just, and yet the Palestinians accepted that. They're the only colonized people in the world that gave up claim to 78% of their country to the colonizers, and yet they get no credit for that. They're considered the terrorists and the ones that are. I can go. There's other things as well, but I think that's really, that's why this settler colonial thing is so important, because it shows the power differentials, and it shows that it goes through this whole thing that you simply can't ignore. for some on paper kind of a two-state idea.
Jeff, I'm going to ask Noura to respond now. Give her an opportunity to talk about some of those. I'd be very keen to hear on something more about leadership issues as well.
Thanks, Harold. Yeah, so I think, so Irvin's argument is basically all the more reason why we need decolonization. Irvin identifies as left-Zionist, yet we heard Irvin just pulling all the Zionist tricks, including victim blaming, where he spoke about, how it's the Palestinians' fault because we didn't accept the partition plan, but then it's also the second intifada, and then it's Hamas. He also did a little bit of a removal of Palestinian agency, where he spoke about what Palestinians want and don't want in terms of solution from a Zionist point of view. And then he did a little bit of misrepresentation of one of my arguments with regards to Jewish people's link and history to the land. The fact that my freedom is offensive to Zionists and left Zionist people is very telling. Yeah, I think also it's important to note that the struggle that the Palestinian people have been leading for the last 70 plus years is not primarily about statehood. That is not really our goal. Any state that does not guarantee the safety, the protection, equality, and universal values, including justice for the Palestinian people, is not something that we are interested in, actually. We're interested in the one democratic state solution because it does provide that kind of solvency. Again, Palestinians are not demanding anything that is above and beyond. It's not radical. We're just demanding basic human rights. We are demanding to live basically freely in our ancestral land. This whole also kind of misrepresentation and misframing and insisting that this is a conflict, and it's only a conflict between two parties if you insist on decontextualizing that conflict. Because what we see in terms of the events in 1967 and the invasion and the occupation and the Nakba are structures of something that is wider and bigger, which is the settler colonial project. So I think saying or insisting on something such as that this is and there is a, or creating that false sense of symmetry that is obviously not existent in the Palestine and Israel context, where you have on the one hand a state actor versus non-state actor. You have one of the most powerful, most resourceful, fully equipped armies versus stateless people. So again, you don't need to have deep understanding in political theory to understand that there's clear asymmetry, jarring asymmetry, and that this is not necessarily a conflict between equal parties. And the power dynamic indicates that there are larger and broader issues here. So I think Irving for his point of view, but what I make of it is that I think it's a little bit outdated as well, as mentioned by Jeff. Also, it is, again, the Palestinians, even though the Palestinian Authority has agreed to sign on Oslo, there's also been voices and prominent voices, including academics such as Edward Said, who have opposed and rejected and saw the Oslo and the two-state solution as a self-defeating move for the Palestinian Authority, which actually later on proved to be very accurate, as we see. That is basically my my addition, and it tells me more why we need that kind of vision to happen in terms of decolonizing land and people.
Harold, can I just add this? Where I'm afraid that Noura and I part company on is the fact that I have no hesitation in recognising Palestinian national rights to their share of Israel, Palestine, whichever way you want to put it. I have no reservation in saying that. And I have no reservation in recognising their right, the Palestinians' right, to their own state. Where we do part company, of course, is that the only real solution that I can see is that there have to be two states alongside each other, and full stop.
Okay. Thanks, Irving. Thanks, Noura. And thanks, Jeff, for that. Gilda, do you have some questions that you're able to put to our panel from the audience? You'll have to unmute yourself.
So the first question that came up was from Dennis, who said that, can you give an example, either Jeff or Noura, of where a multinational country has succeeded, you know, as in one state?
Australia?
Has it?
I don't know.
As Australia, I mean,
Australia seems to be not exactly a failed state. It's pretty multi-ethnic, and you're trying to deal with your colonial past. I mean, there's almost every country in the world is multi-ethnic. There's almost no country, I don't think, in the world that is ethnically pure, which is what Israel is trying to do. So, you know, I don't think that's the problem. I think the issue is, you know, can you create an ethnically pure Jewish state in the 21st century in a country where the majority of the population is not Jewish? I mean, how do you do that? And that relates to one other point I want to make as well. I'll stick in here as well, just to talk about Irving and others. People brought it up. It's come up in the chat. What about the Israelis? The Israelis wouldn't accept this. The Israelis, that's true. I mean, the colonizers will never accept decolonization. Why should they? They're enjoying the good life. I mean, they control the country, control the land, they control the resources, they control the economy, they control everything. Why would they want to give that up? So we see that in South Africa as well. You know, the whites in South Africa were not going to give up apartheid. The ANC knew that. Mandela's not going to go run around and try to convince the white people that for human rights reasons or whatever, South Africa should be a democratic country of all its citizens. They weren't going to buy that. So what the ANC did, and this is what the Palestinians have to do, in my view, is they bypassed them. They said that we are not going to get through to the white population. They are not our partners. What we have to do, and they did this both in the Freedom Charter and in the Constitution that they drafted, they said our vision of South Africa is inclusive of everybody. We're all South Africans. We're going to be a non-racial democracy. But then we understand that the whites are not going to be our partners in this venture. So they had to bypass them. They went to the international community, not the governments that were also against them, but to us, to the Jewish community, to churches, to trade unions. You know, we're all of a certain age. We were all part of the anti-apartheid struggle with an end game. There was always an end game. And that was one person, one vote, one democratic state. And they succeeded in not only making South Africa the apartheid regime collapse, but then the whites did participate in the transition. I mean, I know there's problems in South Africa and the economic part didn't work out, but nevertheless, there was a transition that the whites participated in, even though they were against ending apartheid. Why? Because with the Freedom Charter and the Constitution, they saw that they were a part of the new society. That's what we have to do for Israelis. We can't expect Israeli Jews to be partners with us because they're the colonizers. They're not going to do that. They're not going to decolonize. But at the same time, once the settler colonial regime collapses and we begin to move towards a transition to one democratic state of equal rights, we do expect the Israeli Jews to be part of the transition, because they have to see that they're a part of a democratic society, and the Jews will be secure in that country, because it's a country that will be a democracy with a constitution and equal rights for everyone. And we're going to remove the conflict. We're going to remove the grievances. We're going to remove the reasons why these people were fighting, and we're going to get to one, prosperous state for everyone. So the whole idea that Israeli Jews won't accept this is absolutely true, but it makes sense that they won't accept it. And we have to work around that rather than seeing that as an obstacle. I wish they would accept it, but they're not going to.
I'm conscious of the time. It's now 8:30, which is sort of our tentative time for wind up. But I do want to ask Noura if she has some other comments, and then I'll let Irving make his final comments, and then we'll wind up at that stage.
Yeah, probably just maybe extending on the point that Jeff made, and that's been raised. Sorry, I just had a look at the chat that has been raised by so many with regards to Israelis. Yeah, that's all great. Yes, they may not agree. They may not agree at the moment. Maybe they'll agree in 10 years. Maybe they wouldn't. But from a Palestinian point of view, really, that is irrelevant, because we don't have that luxury. We don't have the time to sit and convince and negotiate our humanity and the fact that we are deserving of basic human rights with the Israelis. I don't think that needs to be explained. I don't think we need to wait for any party in order to fight or demand our rights as humans, but also as indigenous to that land. In the meantime, while the Israelis are contemplating whether we are humans or equal enough for them to have a state in which we all share resources, and we're all free, and we have free access to all parts of the land. In the meantime, people in Gaza are being starved. They're put on a diet. In the meantime, mothers in the West Bank, like Khalida Jarrar, are being prevented from participating in their daughter's funeral. In the meantime, we have people who are risking and facing imminent dispossession and house demolition in Jerusalem. So, with all due respect to all Israelis, whom some of which are my close friends, we don't have that time and we don't have that luxury. We are still going to fight for our rights as basic human rights, but also indigenous rights. We will fight for decolonization, and we will keep pushing for making that change. And if they want to join, they're more than welcome. They don't, that's fine. That's their decision. That's their issue. But also history will note that they were the last ones to join. That's it.
Thanks, Noura. Irving, would you like to make some closing comments then?
I agree with Noura. Something has to change, and things have to change very quickly. And the longer things go on, the worse things will get. If we're looking at a real solution, if we're looking at real progress, it's not the ultimate way out, but the immediate way forward is to end the occupation. And the immediate way forward is to at least have a Palestinian state alongside Israel that is based roughly on the 1967 lines. Where the borders go is a matter for Israelis and Palestinians to sort out. But if you are looking at simply sitting there making a demand for there to be effectively one Palestinian state between the river and the sea, that is the formula by which there will be continued disaster.
It's
and
not a Palestinian
that is
state,
something.
it's a joint state.
Jeff, can I finish? Can I finish, please?
No, but it's not a Palestinian state.
Excuse me. I'd like just to be able to say this without being interrupted. The point is that, Jeff, your intentions, I think, are good, But the point is that what you're advocating is a Palestinian plan. It's not a plan for the whole population, whether it's 50% or otherwise, between the river and the sea. The point is that at least Israelis don't want it. And the opinion polls, and it's not my opinion, the opinion polls on the Palestinian side tend to suggest that they, whilst there's greater support for one state, it's not the state, Jeff, that you're envisaging. What the Palestinians want is, I'm afraid, as Noura says, they want their state. And that is a form of justice which may be desired and desirable, and in some cases even understandable on the part of Palestinians. It's not a result that's going to either be practicable, it won't be reached, and it's something that will deny justice to the other 50% of the population. All it does is replicate the current situation, but in reverse. So if you're asking for the immediate way forward, end the occupation, end it now. Let there be a Palestinian state. Let there be a shared capital in Jerusalem.
Thanks, Irving. Look, I really was looking forward to the opportunity for three people with not necessarily completely diverse views to be able to come to a place where we could have a respectful discussion, and I'm happy with that, despite some sharpness in the position of each of you, which I see as not a problem. I'm going to hand over now for the thank yous to Helena Grunfeld, who is also a committee member of the Australian Jewish Democratic Society, and she will give you the thanks and the closing address. Over to you, Helena. You'll have to unmute.
Okay, well, on behalf of AJDS, and I assume most of the audience here, I want to thank our speakers, Jeff, Noura and Irving, for their very insightful and thought-provoking contributions this evening. Well, I assume I'm not the only one who gained some new insights and perspectives, despite having been involved in this issue for many decades. And not only from the speakers, but also from some of the challenging comments in the chat from the audience. And I also want to thank you for a mostly civilized conversation, which is often very difficult to achieve with such a hotly contested situation. I also want to take this opportunity to put in a plug for Jeff's book, Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine, Zionism, Settler Colonialism, and the Case for One Democratic State. Well, unfortunately, I haven't had time to read it yet, but it's definitely moved up my list of priorities. As Gilda mentioned, we have several interesting events planned for the future. So if you're not already on our mailing list, I think, Gilda, you gave the details already. So I just want to remind those of you who didn't capture it to do so, or you can also look at our website and our Facebook page. So again, thank you very much for a very challenging discussion and something for all of us to think about.
I want to thank you all for inviting me too, and thanks to Noura, and especially thanks to Irving, who we kind of all ganged up on. But Irving, thank you very much for the discussion. I think it was a very good discussion.
Thank you, Jeff, and also thank you, Noura. Again, I suppose we're both carrying out a great Jewish tradition of arguing with each